You know what noon means. 12 o'clock, middle of the day. But noon used to mean something specific, the exact moment the sun crossed the meridian, directly above wherever you stood. Your noon, not Chicago's, not New York's, yours. In 1883, America had over 300 of them. Michigan alone had 27. Then 30 railroad executives met in a Chicago hotel, and 5 weeks later, every one of those noons was erased. No law, no vote, no act of Congress, just a telegraph signal and a stopped clock. The sun kept moving at the same pace. The human body kept following it. Nobody asked either one. 4 minutes. That's how long the pendulum hung still. On November 18th, 1883, at the Western Union Building in New York City, a man named James Hamblett stopped his standard clock. The long, glistening rod and its heavy cylindrical ball just stopped. 3 minutes and 58.38 seconds. And when that pendulum swung again, 55 million Americans were living on a different kind of time. Not the sun's, not theirs, the railroads. No one voted on it, no president signed it, no act of Congress authorized it. 30 men in a hotel in Chicago decided what noon meant, and it stuck for 35 years before anyone in government even wrote it down. I wasn't looking for this. I was researching something else entirely. An old jeweler's shop in Burlington, Iowa. One of those footnotes you stumble on and can't quite leave alone. The jeweler's name was G. H. Waldin, and in a detail I almost scrolled past, I found that the Smithsonian Institution itself had sent Waldin a formula, a handwritten set of calculations, so he could derive Burlington's local time from telegraph signals out of Chicago. Burlington's noon ran 13 minutes and 56 seconds behind Chicago's. Not approximately, precisely, because in 1883, Burlington had its own noon. So did every other town in America. That's the part that stopped me. Not that we changed the clocks, I knew that. What stopped me was what existed before, and how completely it's been erased from memory. We talk about standard time like it was always there, a natural feature of civilization, like running water or the postal service. But it wasn't. It was invented in a specific room on a specific date by a specific group of men who had a specific financial interest in making the sun irrelevant. And the deeper I looked, the stranger it got. Because it turns out the human body never agreed to the change. The sun never agreed to the change. And in 2017, 3 scientists won the Nobel Prize for proving why. Here's what existed before November 18th, 1883. Every American community kept its own local mean solar time. Noon was the moment the sun crossed the local meridian, the highest point in the sky directly overhead. It wasn't symbolic, it was mechanical. A town jeweler would check a sundial, correct for the seasonal equation of time, a plus or minus 16-minute variation caused by Earth's elliptical orbit, and set the reference clock, usually a church steeple. Church bells broadcast the time to the community. The number of distinct local times across the country exceeded 300. Michigan alone had 27. Wisconsin had 38. Indiana had 23. The rule of thumb was clean and elegant. For every degree of longitude, local time shifted 4 minutes. When it was noon in Chicago, it was 12:07 in Indianapolis, 11:50 in St. Louis, 11:41 in St. Paul, and 11:27 in Omaha. Every town's noon belonged to the sun that hung over that town. And farm labor, which was most labor, followed it. George Washington's Mount Vernon documented field hands working sunrise to sunset, which meant 14-hour days in summer and short ones in winter. The body's clock and the sun's clock were the same clock. They had been for all of human history. But the railroads had a problem. A passenger on the Pennsylvania Railroad arriving in Baltimore found local time 5 minutes behind Philadelphia. If that passenger continued west on the Baltimore and Ohio, the train ran on Baltimore time until Ohio, where it switched to Columbus time. then to Vincennes, Indiana time, west of Cincinnati. In Buffalo, New York, 3 station clocks showed 3 different times. Roughly 50 railroad companies each ran on their own operating time, and when 2 trains shared a single track section and disagreed about how many minutes remained before a scheduled crossing, people died. August 12, 1853, Valley Falls, Rhode Island, Providence and Worcester Railroad. A southbound excursion train carrying roughly 475 passengers collided head-on with a northbound train on a blind curve. The conductor, Frederick W. Putnam, was running behind schedule and calculated he had 4 minutes to clear the single-track section. The rules required 5. 14 people were killed, 17 severely injured. The railroad paid $43,876 to victims' families, about $1.66 million in today's dollars. A photographer named L. Wright captured what is believed to be the first daguerreotype ever taken of a train wreck. The collisions were real, the danger was real. But what happened next wasn't a democratic reform, it was a corporate takeover. The man who built the system was William Frederick Allen, secretary of the General Time Convention and managing editor of the Traveller's Official Railway Guide. The General Time Convention was the railroad industry's coordinating body. Founded in 1872 in Louisville, Kentucky, Allen synthesized earlier theoretical proposals. Charles Dowd, a school principal, had suggested time zones in 1869. Sanford Fleming, chief engineer of the Canadian Pacific Railway, proposed worldwide standard time in 1876. Cleveland Bay, the first head of the U.S. Weather Bureau, recommended 4 zones in 1879. Allen took the ideas and made them operational. On October 11, 1883, at the Grand Pacific Hotel in Chicago, 231 South LaSalle Street, approximately 30 railroad companies, representing 78,000 miles of track, adopted a 4-zone plan. Companies managing an additional 60,000 miles had already voted affirmative by mail. The Linda Hall Library describes the vote as unanimously approved, though no exact recorded tally has been located in primary sources. Then, 38 days later, they imposed it. November 18, 1883. Sunday. At noon Eastern Standard Time, synchronized telegraph signals from the Allegheny Observatory in Pittsburgh and the U.S. Naval Observatory in Washington triggered the changeover. In cities where local time ran ahead of the new standard, citizens experienced noon twice. They called it the Day of Two Noons. In New York, Hamlet stopped his pendulum for those famous 3 minutes and 58.38 seconds. The New York Times reported that curious crowds gathered in front of jewelry stores, some unable to understand how time could be changed without serious consequences. In Chicago, clocks were stopped for 9 minutes and 32 seconds. A Tribune reporter compared the scene to the biblical story of Joshua commanding the sun to stand still. In Boston, Harvard Observatory's Professor Pickering watched through a telescope for the time ball signal, and approximately 16 minutes were rolled back. In Philadelphia, William E. Harper climbed into the belfry of Independence Hall and spent 10 minutes adjusting the mechanism, making the city 36 seconds faster. The Indianapolis Daily Sentinel had editorialized the day before, "The sun is no longer to boss the job. People, all 55 million of them, must eat, sleep and work as well as travel by railroad time. It is a revolt, a rebellion." And it was, except the rebels were the railroads, revolting against the sun. Attorney General Benjamin Brewster ruled that no federal department could change its clocks without congressional authorization. The superintendent of the Naval Observatory ignored the order and began telegraphing standard time anyway. And Congress didn't authorize standard time until March 19, 1918, 35 years later, when Woodrow Wilson signed the Standard Time Act. For more than 3 decades, the time system of 55 million people rested on no legal authority beyond a railroad industry agreement. That's thread one. A private industry replaced a natural system and didn't ask permission. But here's what connects it to something I didn't expect to find, Tamain, and couldn't stop reading once I did. In October 2017, the Nobel Assembly at Karolinska Institutet in Stockholm awarded the prize in physiology or medicine to Geoffrey Hall, Michael Rosbash, and Michael Young for discovering the molecular mechanisms controlling circadian rhythm. In 1984, Hall and Rosbash and independently Young isolated a gene in fruit flies called period. They found that a protein called PER accumulates at night and degrades during the day, creating a feedback loop that cycles roughly every 24 hours. In 1994, Young discovered 2 more genes, timeless and double time, that fine-tune the mechanism. The Nobel Committee's statement included a sentence that once you've spent a few weeks reading about railroad time, hits differently. There are indications that chronic misalignment between our lifestyle and the rhythm dictated by our inner timekeeper is associated with increased risk for various diseases. Chronic misalignment between our lifestyle and our inner timekeeper. They were describing something a German chronobiologist named Till Röneberg had been measuring for years. In 2006, Röneberg coined the term social jet lag, the gap between the time your body wants to sleep and the time society tells you to. Using data from over 198,000 participants, his lab found that 69% of the population experiences at least 1 hour of social jet lag. 1/3 suffers 2 hours or more. And for every hour of social jet lag, the probability of being overweight rises by roughly 33%. Röneberg told Popular Science, for practically every pathology or health deficit that we look at, the more social jet lag you have, the higher your probability of developing it. And here's where it gets precise. In 2019, economists Osea Giuntella and Fabrizio Mazzona compared counties on either side of US time zone borders, places just miles apart, sharing the same culture and economy, but assigned to different clocks. People on the late sunset side, the western edge, went to bed 19 minutes later, but couldn't sleep in because of fixed work and school schedules. The result? Approximately 115 hours of lost sleep per year. They were 11% more likely to be overweight, 21% more likely to be obese, and had a 19% increased risk of heart attack. They even earned 3% lower wages. The time zone border is an invisible line, but the bodies on either side of it know exactly where it is. Sometimes I pause and ask myself if I'm drawing lines between things that don't connect. Standard Time solved a real problem. Trains were crashing, schedules were chaos, and the 300-time patchwork genuinely endangered lives. Maybe the railroads did what government couldn't. Maybe the health effects are just the cost of modernity, unrelated to a decision made in 1883. But then I look at who resisted, and for how long, and what they said. Detroit held out for 22 years. 22 years. After every other major city in America had adopted Standard Time, Detroit refused. The Mackinac Center documented it. The view that the sun, not man, dictated what time it was enjoyed broad support in the city. Henry Ford personally designed a watch with 2 dials, one for local time, one for standard. In 1900, City Council ordered clocks set back 28 minutes to Central Standard Time. Half the city obeyed, half refused. Council rescinded the order. Someone made a facetious offer to erect a sundial in front of City Hall. It was scornfully referred to the Committee on Sewers. Detroit didn't adopt Standard Time until a citywide vote in 1905. In Bath, Maine, in 1887, a town meeting voted 605 to 157 to return to local time, in defiance of the state legislature. Town officers overruled the voters and kept standard time. The mayor compromised. The town bell would ring at 6:40, 11:40, 12:40, and 5:40 standard time, matching 7 o'clock, noon, 1 o'clock, and 6 o'clock by the old solar clock, 2 times, rung on the same bell. In Augusta, Georgia, the city rejected standard time outright. A newspaper reported, without ceremony of any kind, the hands of the city clock were pushed forward 32 minutes at noon, and Augusta was again placed abreast of the sun. And in courtrooms across Massachusetts, the legal question was argued explicitly. A magistrate hostile to the time change found a man named Clapp in default for appearing at 10:01 by old time, which was 9:45 by new time. The case went to Superior Court. The attorney's argument was simple. Standard time was invalid because the legislature hadn't approved it. He was right. It hadn't. It wouldn't for another 30 years. The religious objection cut even deeper. Smithsonian curator Carleen Stevens documented that evangelical Christians argued time came from God and railroads were not to mess with it. As late as 1964, Representative Kenneth Gray of Illinois declared on the House floor that standard time is God's time. Some senators opposed to daylight saving time hung signs on their office doors reading, "This office operates on God's time." And the farmers. The popular myth says daylight saving time was created for farmers. The Library of Congress confirms the opposite. The agriculture industry fervently opposed the measure because farming schedules are based on sunrise and sunset, not the clock. More than 300 farmers' publications opposed DST. Farmers testified that morning dew sat until 9 a.m. real time, 10 a.m. on the shifted clock, costing an hour of field work. Dairy cows gave less milk when their schedules were disrupted. The National Grange said DST added 10% to the cost of operating a farm. Some farmers threatened to produce only enough food to feed their own families. DST was imposed in March 1918 and repealed by August 1919, over 2 presidential vetoes. The real advocates were department store owners, baseball team owners, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The farmers won the repeal. But the larger battle, the one about who owns noon, they had already lost in 1883. And that loss echoed outward. Standard time wasn't an isolated event. It was one instrument in an orchestra of standardization that played across the same decades. The National Banking Act of 1863 standardized currency. In 1864, William Sellers proposed a standard screw thread. In 1866, the Metric Act recognized the metric system. In 1886, over 36 hours, workers converted roughly 11,500 miles of Southern Railroad track from 5-foot gauge to standard gauge by moving one rail 3 inches inward. Meanwhile, factory owners were standardizing the human body. E.P. Thompson's foundational 1967 paper described how pre-industrial societies lived by task-oriented time, work organized around harvests, and daylight, no boundary between work and life. Industrialization turned time into a commodity. Thompson quoted it plainly. Time was not passed, but spent. James Miles, a Dundee factory worker, testified in 1850. Masters and managers did with us as they liked. The clocks at the factories were often put forward in the morning and back at night. In Belfast linen mills, 21 of 32 locked out workers who were even minutes late. Marx documented factory owners adding 15 minutes at the start and end of each day, cutting meal breaks, stealing 340 minutes per week. Workers had a name for it. They called it nibbling and cribbling. And in 1888, 5 years after the day of 2 noons, a jeweler in Binghamton, New York, named Willard LeGrand Bundy, patented the time clock, U.S. Patent No. 393,205, a mechanical device that printed the exact time and employee number on paper tape when a key was inserted. By 1911, the Bundy Manufacturing Company had merged into the Computing Tabulating Recording Company that renamed International Business Machines in 1924. IBM, the punch clock, gave birth to big tech. The instrument that measured your compliance with corporate time became the seed of the corporation that would define the digital age. Not coincidence, sequence. 1853, a train wreck caused by a 4-minute miscalculation kills 14 people. 1872, the railroad industry forms a time coordination body. 1883, 30 executives in a Chicago hotel replace the sun. 1884, an international conference makes Greenwich the world's meridian, 22-1. 1888, the time clock is patented. 1918, Congress finally makes it law. 1924, the time clock company becomes IBM. 1967, Thomson names what happened, the commodification of time itself. 2006, Roenneberg measures the biological cost. 69% of us misaligned by an hour or more. 2017, the Nobel Committee confirms the molecular clock runs in every cell, each step plausible on its own, each one solving a real problem or measuring a real phenomenon. Together, they trace something harder to dismiss, a 140-year arc from solar noon to social jet lag, from the church bell to the punch clock, from time as something the sun gave you to time as something your employer sold back. So why does no one talk about the 35-year legal void, the fact that the most basic organizing principle of American life had no federal authority behind it until 1918? Why did the superintendent of the Naval Observatory ignore a direct order from the Attorney General and telegraph standard time anyway? Why does a person in Grand Rapids, Michigan, whose solar noon arrives at 12:43 p.m., share the same noon as a person in Boston, whose solar noon arrives at 11:44, a gap of nearly 1 hour between two bodies supposedly on the same clock? Why do the people on the western edge of time zones, the ones whose clocks are most disconnected from the sun, lose 115 hours of sleep per year and face a 21% higher obesity rate? And why, when Detroit resisted for 22 years, and Bath voted 605 to 157, and farmers organized the repeal of daylight saving in 18 months, why do we remember none of it? I don't have answers, only the pattern. Every morning, the sun still crosses every local meridian at its own pace. It doesn't check with Chicago. It doesn't consult the Naval Observatory. And somewhere in your body, in a protein that accumulates at night and degrades during the day, in a molecular loop that has been cycling for longer than railroads, longer than clocks, longer than language, something still knows what time it really is. The pendulum stopped for less than 4 minutes. The body hasn't forgotten in 143 years.